Yes, said Kotar, unless something unforeseen happens, and the unforeseen can always happen. True pointed out that in any case the prefecture had, to some extent, foreseen the unforeseen, and providing for a period of 2 weeks before the gates will open. They were right to do so, said Kotar, still in the dark and agitated mood, because with the same ways things are going, they might well have been wasting their breath. True considered this possible, but thought that there was still better to look forward to the gates being opened soon and life returning to normal. Perhaps, Kotar said, perhaps so. But what do you call a return to normal life? New films in the cinema, said True with a smile, but Kotar was not smiling. He wanted to know if one could imagine the plague might change nothing in the town and that everything would begin again as before, that is to say, as though nothing had happened. True thought that the plague would not change the town, that, of course, the greatest desire of the fellow citizens was and would be to behave as though nothing had happened, and that, consequently, the sense nothing would have changed, but that in another sense one cannot forget everything. But with the best will in the world, so the plague would leave its mark, at least on people's hearts. The little man started quite openly, and that he was not interested in the heart, and indeed that the heart was the last thing he was to worry about. What did interest him was to know if the whole administration would be transformed, and if, for example, all departments would be operating as in the past. True had to admit that he had no idea. According to him, it must be assumed that such departments, having been distributed by the plague, would have trouble starting up again. One must assume, too, that the host of the new problems would arise, making necessary for at least to be reckoned the reorganization of the old administration. Ah, said Kotar, that's possible. Everyone will have to start again. The two men had come close to Kotar's house. With his excited forcing himself to be optimistic, he imagined the town starting to live again from zero and wiping out the past. Good, said True. After all, things may work out for you too. In a sense, it's starting a new life. They were shaking hands at the door. You're right, said Kotar, growing increasingly agitated. Start again from nothing. That would be good. The two men had sprung up from the shadows of the corridor. True had hardly time to hear his colleagues ask what the customers could possibly want. The customer, who looked like the civil servant in Sunday's best, were asking Kotar to confirm that he was Kotar when, giving a short, muffled cry, he swung around and was gone into the night before the two men or True had time to make a single movement. True asked the two men what they wanted, and they assumed the air of polite reserve, saying that only that it was a matter of information, and then left the deliberate peace and the detection that Kotar had taken. Back home, True described the scene, and immediately afterwards the handwriting bear witness noted that he was tired and added that he still had a lot to do, but that this was not a reason for keeping in readiness. He asked himself if he was in fact ready. Finally, or this is where True's notebook ended, he replied that there was always an hour of day and night when a man should cower and that was afraid of nothing but that moment. The day after next, a few days before the opening of the gates, Dr. Yu was coming home from lunchtime wondering if he would find a telegram that he was expecting. Although his days were exhausting as at the height of the plague, the expectation of being freed at last had disappeared all his own tiredness. Now he had hope, and he had pleased that he did. One cannot continually tighten one's will and brace oneself, and it is a joy at last to be released from the bundle of force, pitted them together by the struggling, and let them flow free. As if expected telegram was also favorable, then Ryu could start again, and it felt to him as though everyone had starting again. He went past the concierge lounge and the concierge, his face pressed the little window, smiled at him, and he went up the stairs. Ryu saw his own face, pale with exhaustion and privation. Yes, he would start again, when the abstraction was over, and with a little luck. But he opened his door at the very moment when his mother came to meet him, saying that M. Teru was unwell. He had gotten up the morning and was unable to go out, so he had to return to his bed. Ryu was worried. Perhaps it's nothing serious, his son said. Teru was lying flat out, his heavy head making a dent in the loud cloister, his large chest outlined beneath the thick blankets. He had a temperature and a headache, and told Ryu that he was in the vague symptoms that could easily be those of the plague. No, nothing definite yet, said Ryu, after examining him. But Teru was raging thirst, and the corridor of the doctor told his mother that this might be the start of the plague. Oh no, she said. That it can't be, not now. Then immediately afterwards, let's get him here, Bernard. Ryu thought it. I don't have the right, he said, but the gates are going to reopen. I think that this would be the first right, and I would claim for myself if you were not here. Bernard, she said, keep us both. You know I have just been re-vaccinated. The doctor said that the same was true for Teru, but that perhaps because he was tired he must have forgotten the last injection of the serum and forgotten to take some of the precautions. Ryu was already on his way to the consulting room when he got back to the bedroom. Teru saw that he was crying, carrying a huge ampoules of the serum. So that's it, he said. No, this is a precaution. In the reply, Teru said merely held out his arm and submitted to the interminable injection that he had himself given to others. We'll see this evening, said Ryu, looking directly at Teru. What about isolating me, Ryu? It's not all certainly that you have the plague. Teru made an effort to smile. This is the first time that he had seen you injecting the serum without ordering isolation at the same time. Ryu turned away. My mother and I will look after you. You will be better off here. Teru said nothing, and the doctor, who was putting away the ampoules, waited for him to speak, turning around, and in the end he went over to the bed, the sick man looking at him. His face was tired, but with his great eyes were calm. Ryu smiled. Sleep if you can. I'll be back shortly. When he got to the door, he heard Teru's voice calling him. He turned around, but Teru seemed to be struggling against putting what he had to say into words. Ryu, he finally managed to get out. You must tell me everything. I need that. I promise. The other man twisted his face into a smile. Thank you. I don't want to die, and I shall fight. But if the struggling is lost, you want to make a good end. Ryu bent down and squeezed his shoulder. No, he said, to become a saint, you must have to live. Fight it. During the day, the cold, in which started sharp, slackened a little and gave way to the afternoon violent downpour of rain and hail. At the dusk of the sky cleared and the cold became more penetrating. Ryu went back home in the evening. Without taking off his coat, he went to his friend's room, and the mother was knitting. Teru seemed not to have moved, but his lips, whitened by the fever, spoke and the struggle that he was having to endure. Well, asked the doctor. Teru raised his thick shoulders a little out of the bed. Well, he said, I'm losing. The doctor leant over him. The lymph nodes were nodding under his burning skin, and the chest seemed to be rumbling with the noises of an underground forge. Unusually, Teru was presenting the two sets of symptoms. Ryu said that he had got up, and the serum had not yet had time to take full effect. A surge of fever in his throat drawned a few words from Teru's tired and uttered a reply. After dinner, Ryu and his mother came to sit with the patient. The night started with him in the struggle, and Ryu knew that the fierce combat against the angel of the plague would last until dawn. Teru's wide chest and broad shoulders were not his best defiance, and that was the blood that Ryu had made flow just now in the needle, and in the blood something deeper in the soul, which no signs could reveal. All he could do was watch his friend struggle. Several months of repeated failures had taught him to judge the efficiency of the remedies that he would apply in the toxins and what he would inject in the abstances that he would lance. In reality, he only task was to give the opportunity that, with good luck, which only too often does not appear unless provokes it, and the luck was what he needed, because Ryu was confronted with an aspect of the plague that disconcerted him. Once more, it was devastating away the foiling of the strategies abandoned against it, appearing where it was least expected and disappearing just as it seemed to already be settled. Once more, it was making an effort to astound. Toru was struggling, motionless. Not once in the course of the night did he become agitated by the assault of the disease, fighting only with his solidarity and silence. But not once either did he speak, thus admitting to his own way that he could not afford to lose the concentration. Ryu followed the phases of the struggle only with his eyes, as his friend, which were by turns open and shut, the eyelids either more tight against the globe of his eyes, or the cautionary relaxed, so his gaze was fixed on the object that brought back the doctor and his mother. Every time the doctor met his look, Toru smiled with considerable effort. At one time, they heard a hurried footsteps in the streets. They seemed to be fleeing in front of the distant rumbling and gradually approached. Eventually filled the streets with sounds of running water, and the rain had started again, soon mixed with the halt and chatter of the pavements. Great awnings flapped in front of the windows. In the darkness of the room, Ryu, momentarily distracted by the rain, looked back at Toru, who was lit by the bedside lamp. His mother was knitting, raising her head from time to time to look closely at the sick man. Now the doctor had done all that he was to do. After the rain had silence thickened in the room, and that only full of noiseless Thompson of the Invisible War. Against the insomnia, the doctor thought that he could hear beyond the silence and the soft, regular whistle that accompanied throughout the epidemic. He nodded to his mother to go to bed. She shook her head and her eyes lit up, and then miraculously examined the dubious stitches at the end of her needles. Ryu got up and to get the patient some water and went back to his place. Some passersby, taking advantage of the lull of the storm, were walking quickly along the pavement. Their footsteps grew fainter and faded into the distance. For the first time, the doctor realized that his night was full of late strolls without ambulance sirens. It was like those of the former times. The night labeled from the plague, and it seemed that the sickness had driven out by the cold light and the crowds, escaped from the darkest depths of the town and taken refuge in the warm, and makes the final assault in the motionless form of Toru. The pestilence was no longer thrashing the sky above the town with the fails, but the whistle softly in the heavy air of the room. This is what Ryu had been hearing for hours, and he needed it to stop here, so that here too the plague would admit defeat. Shortly before dawn, Ryu leant across to his mother. "You should get some sleep, so you can take over for me at 8 o'clock. Take your drops before you go to bed." Ryu got up and put aside her knitting and went over to the bed. For some time now, Toru's eyes had been closed, and the sweat had left his hair of his curls and his hard forehead. Ryu sighed, and the sick man opened his eyes. He saw that the kind face leaned towards him and breathed the waves of fever, doggedly smiled, appeared once more. But the eyes closed again immediately, and when he was alone, Ryu took over the chair that his mother had just left. The streets were soundless, and that the silence was now complete. The cold of the morning had started to make itself felt in the room. The doctor dozed off, and for the first wagon of dawn aroused him. He shuddered and looked at Toru, realizing that there had been a pause and that the sick man was also sleeping. And the wood and iron wheels of the horse-drawn wagon could be heard fading in the distance. Once outside the window, it was still dark. When the doctor went over to the bed, Teru was looking at him with expressionless eyes, as though still on the side of sleep. "Did you sleep, didn't you?" Ryu asked. "Yes. And you're breathing more easily. A little. Does that mean something?" Ryu paused and then said, "No, Teru, it doesn't mean anything. You know about the morning remission as well as I do." Teru nodded in approval. "Thank you," he said. "Always answer me precisely." Ryu sat down beside the bed. He felt the patient's legs next to him, as long and hard the limbs of his Effie and Tombstone. Teru was breathing more heavily. "The fever was going to come back, isn't it, Ryu?" he said breathlessly. "Yes, but by midday you should know how things stand." Teru closed his eyes and seemed to be gathering his strength. There was a look of exhaustion on his face. He was waiting for the fever to rise from where it had already stirring somewhere deep inside him. When he reopened his eyes, were glazed, and he did not clear until he saw Ryu leaning over the bed. "Drink," the doctor said. The other man drank and let his head fall back. "It takes a long time," he said. Ryu took his arm, but Teru looked the other way and did not react. Suddenly the fever visibly swept through the body and the forehead as though it had broken some inner dike. When Teru again turned towards the doctor, Ryu's drawn features had looked in the encouragement. The smile that Teru again tried to form could not get beyond his clenched jaw and the lips sealed with wished foam, and that the stiffened face and his eyes shone the bright courage. At 7 o'clock, Ryu came back into the room, and the doctor went into his consulting room to ring the hospital to arrange the replacement. He also decided that to postpone his consultation and sketched out on the couch. He got up again almost immediately and went back into the bedroom. Teru's head was turning towards Ryu. He was looking at the little figure slumped beside him in the chair, her hands folded on her lap. He was staring at her with such intensity that Ryu put her fingers to her lips and got up to turn off the bedside lamp. But the daylight that rapidly increasing beyond the curtains, and shortly afterwards, when the sick man's face emerged in the darkness, Ryu saw that he was still looking at her. She leant towards him, smoothed his pillow, and getting up, put her hands for a moment on his damp, twisted hair. It was then that she heard a dull voice which appeared to be coming from a long way off. "Thanks her that says now everything was all right." And she sat down again. Teru had closed his eyes with exhausted face, seemed, in spite of the sealed mouth, to be smiling again. At noon, the fever reached its height, and the sort of gut cough shook the patient's belly, and he was spitting blood. The lymph nodes had stopped swelling, but they were still there, and the iron screws of his joints, and Ryu decided that it was impossible to lance them. In the intervals between the fever and the coughing, Teru occasionally looked at his friends, but after a short while his eyes opened less and less frequently, and the light would shine from the ravishing features to the paler every time. The storm was shaking his body, and the convulsions shuddered the lit of increasingly infrequent flashes, and Teru was slowly drifting in the midst of the tempest. Now Ryu had in the front of him just the still mask from which the smile faded, the human form which had been so close to him and now pierced the spears, burnt with a superhuman fire and twisted by all the malevolent winds of the skies. It was shrieking before his eyes, and the waters of the plague that he could not do nothing to prevent its wreck. He had to stay on the shore, and his hands empty with a heart wrenched to no means, once more to prevent the disaster. In the end, it was tears of frustration that stopped Ryu from seeing Teru quickly turn towards the wall and expire the hollow mourns as though somewhere in him some essential chord had snapped.